Matthew 22, verses 15 to 22. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are a man of integrity, and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the poll tax to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites! Why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And when they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away.
We thank God for his word, those who have preserved it for us and those who read it for us week by week. And this week's Gospel reading introduces us to another of those episodes in the final week of the earthly life of Jesus, when he finds himself in dispute with the religious authorities of his day. In all honesty, they have been there in the background from the word go. In the early days of his ministry up in the north, chapter 9 of Matthew's Gospel records an episode when he healed a man who couldn't walk, and they were outraged because Jesus dared to declare that this man's sins were forgiven. And then they expressed their disapproval at the company that Jesus kept, because he went to the houses and hung out with the kind of people that the religious classes preferred to look down on. They accused him of being in league with the devil when he healed a blind man, and they criticised Jesus for letting his disciples eat grain in a field on their Sabbath day. And we're told as early as chapter 12 that the Pharisees in particular became so outraged with the things that Jesus did and the fact that he always seemed to have an answer for them, that they began to plot how they could get rid of him. And that's when this stream of constant questions begins to emerge. What they are repeatedly seeking to do is to draw Jesus into saying something that will either make him incredibly unpopular with all the crowds and therefore lose his influence, or incriminate himself before the Roman authorities, and that would allow them to have him silenced by the state. But it's when he arrives in Jerusalem that the heat really gets turned on, partly because he has entered their territory, so to speak, but also because Jesus is increasingly blunt and honest in his criticism of them. But what we also discover is that Jesus has now attracted the disdain of another group. Those who first criticised him were, if you like, the religious fundamentalists, the Pharisees and the scribes. They were as brassed off with the political and the economic scene as anyone. But their belief was that things could only be put right through strict and thorough religious observance. If we meticulously put the rules and the regulations that God has given us into practice, they argued, then we will somehow attract God's favour and God will sort all our problems out for us. But into the fray now comes another influential group, the Herodians. Now, they don't actually appear that often in the Gospels, but there's something significant about the way that they do here. Because the Herodians pretty much represent everything that the Pharisees don't. So, yeah, they wanted to see the nation of Israel successful, but as far as they were concerned, it was successful because it was serving their interests. They were pretty pragmatic in how they went about things. If collaboration with Rome serves our interests, then we'll collaborate. And let's not let our religion and our heritage get in the way. In fact, let's use that heritage as a way of achieving our own ends. So, as their name suggests, they were supporters of King Herod, who'd been established by the Romans as a kind of vassal ruler who'd create enough national identity to keep everyone in order, but it was sufficiently weak and obligated to always be able to be dictated to by Rome at the end of the day. And the point is that the Pharisees in normal circumstances hated the Herodians because Herod gathered around himself those cronies who could benefit from the fact that he was benefiting, and they were those people. They represented everything that the Pharisees stood against. They were not into to religious purity, but political expediency, and they profited and they gained from the people being subjugated by Rome. And they were the ones who set up the great religious festivals, which were just really a people-pleasing charade. So if your conviction is that the nation is in such a state because God is so displeased with it, you're going to loathe the collective of people who are just using the things of God for their own ends. So you begin to see how remarkable it is that these two groups are suddenly intent on working together. And the underlying point here is that their hatred and loathing of Jesus, the common enemy, is so great that they're prepared to set aside all their traditional differences in order to get rid of him. Now, we're going to think a little bit more about the detail of this episode in a moment, but let's just first stand back and take in the broader scene, so to speak. The nation is in a mess. There's division and there's argument between the different power brokers about how the problems should be addressed. There are those who want to see people protected, in their case, from what they saw as a moral disease. And there are those who are saying, let's just build a strong economy and let's just be politically expedient and work around the difficulties. Does that sound just a little bit familiar as we reflect on all the various arguments that have been raging this week about local lockdown? And what I want us to notice is that Jesus is absolutely in the thick of a world like that. Let's think about that a bit further. You know, one of the narratives that threads through the gospel that we haven't particularly picked up on is the imprisonment and the death of John the Baptist, a close relative of Jesus and someone with whom Jesus clearly had a close and a meaningful relationship. And it's in the courts of Herod, possibly in front of the very courtiers who are now challenging Jesus in the temple square, that John comes to a gruesome and an unjust end. And of course, Herod and his cronies will play an instrumental role in the eventual death of Jesus. So Jesus engages in this conversation as one who has, in a very real way, felt the sting of this oppressive and self-seeking regime for himself. And as I've already outlined, the entire ministry of Jesus had been accompanied by this relentless narrative of criticism and opposition from the Pharisees. And I simply want you to pause and to notice that this one that we call Jesus, the Word made flesh, God with us, is impacted by all of this. Our God is not a God who is remote and indifferent. And as we come together to engage with God's word in the midst of a world where there is so much opposition and argument about the very real problems that we're now facing, where many of us will gather together as those who are impacted by that, perhaps through our own health or losing our income or being afraid that we will, or having lost loved ones to this horrible pandemic. And many of us simply feel wearied by this seemingly endless situation. We come to a God who knows how it feels to be caught up in the midst of a world that's just like that. And we come to a God who offers us a message of hope and assurance from its very centre. Not by turning his back on that world or trying to somehow take our minds off things, but by engaging with us and speaking to us from the heart of a very similar set of human circumstances. And we cannot ignore the fact that the shadow of the cross is hanging over these events in the last week of Jesus' life. God's hope does not come from escaping what's going on around, but by making sense of it, by making God's sense of it. So hold on to that reality as we continue to navigate our way through these troubling times. But let's get back to the detail of this story. The Pharisees and the Herodians have come together, arch enemies, united in their common loathing of Jesus, and they ask him a question about paying taxes to Caesar, the Roman emperor. Now, this is why I wanted to spend some time familiarizing ourselves with the backstory to these two groups, because each of them actually represents the embodiment of the two answers that they're looking for Jesus to offer in reply. It was a deliberately incriminating question, and there are, of course, only two answers, yes or no. And this was not a question, let's be clear about this, this was not a question about whether it's okay to fiddle our tax return. This struck at the very heart of the nation's identity. They believed that their land was a God-given inheritance and belonged to nobody but them. And it was an affront on everything that they believed about themselves, every narrative of their history, to be living in their own land under the occupation of a foreign invading power. It undermined the religious narratives about the greatness of God, because in their eyes, God's greatness was revealed through their greatness. So paying taxes to Rome was not about funding the roads and the aqueducts and the so-called Pax Roma. This was an insult to their identity, to their heritage, and to their faith. So for Jesus to say, yes, we should be paying the poll tax to Rome, would have caused outrage to any self-respecting Jewish temple goer. But of course, Jesus would have been repeating exactly the same narrative that defined the lifestyle and the position of the Herodians. They were quite happy for people to pay taxes to Rome because it funded them. That's why this was such an act of hypocrisy. The very people who asked the question represented the answer that they were seeking to draw out of Jesus. And so by answering yes in front of the Herodians, Jesus would have attracted all of the hate and the resentment and the unpopularity that was usually reserved for them. But if Jesus had said no, if Jesus had stood up in a public square under the eyes and the scrutiny of the Roman authorities as one of the most prominent and influential civic events was going on, and announced to a crowd over which he had significant influence that it was wrong to pay the poll tax to Rome, then they could have immediately reported him to the authorities, who would have almost certainly arrested him and one way or another made sure that his voice was never heard again. But of course, that was exactly the point of view that the Pharisees had. They may not have stood up in public squares and announced it. They might not have allowed themselves to be seen openly to actively promote it. But no one was in any doubt that your average Pharisee was totally against paying taxes to Rome. So they are trying to define Jesus by their own narratives. And basically what they wanted to do was to pin all of the aspirations and differences that they represented and to dump the consequences of that onto the shoulders of Jesus. And of course, Jesus answers their question brilliantly. He asks them to find a coin, and he asks them whose head appears on it. And as they say it's Caesar's, then he announces, well, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's. And that's a quote that has actually found its way into common language. It's even got its own page on Wikipedia. But I want to suggest to you that there are three ways that we might respond to this phrase, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. The first is to just recognise the sheer brilliance of the answer, which of course is absolutely true. You know, I read moments like this in the life of Jesus and I think, if only I could come up with something so brilliantly clever when someone backs me into a corner. But I guess we should expect that of Jesus. I mean, if Jesus is who we believe Jesus to be, then we would expect him to display that level of intellect. But you know, over the years, I've heard many people come up with brilliant answers to difficult questions when they're backed into a corner. And very often, while I can admire their intellect, you know that in reality, that's exactly what's just happened. They've been backed into a corner, not by someone else's agenda, but by their own. And you know that even though they've managed to brilliantly wriggle their way out of it, they have nonetheless been exposed by the question. And I think it's important that we recognise that kind of human behaviour, because it's all too easy for us to sometimes admire the words of Jesus, to agree that they're brilliantly put together, but nonetheless not to actually put them into practice. You know, it's worth pausing to notice here that if we read back through Matthew's Gospel to chapter 7, He tells a story of a wise and a foolish builder, and he equates each of them in turn to someone who does or does not put his words into practice. And what I want us to notice is that both of those builders hear the words of Jesus. They're not judged by their ability to listen. They're judged by their willingness to act. And so, yeah, we might admire Jesus' response in this awkward moment. We may want to cheer another victory for Jesus in this mounting intellectual battle. But if all we can see here is rhetoric to be admired, we are missing the point. Jesus is inviting us to learn from his words and to put them into practice. As someone once said to me, the words of Jesus are intended to be lived, not laminated. But I've also heard people respond to this particular statement of Jesus as a kind of dismissal of any kind of engagement in the real world. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. In other words, the affairs of the world around us are someone else's problem. The church should keep out of them. And I want to say that I think this is also a failure to grasp the true reality of what's going on here and what Jesus is saying. And I realise that not everyone may agree with me on that. So let me tell you why I believe that that's so. Jesus asks them for a coin. And that may well be a detail that we too easily overlook, because what we discover is it doesn't take them very long to produce one. They were embroiled in this world. They were carrying coins in their pockets that declared the sovereignty of the one whose legitimacy they were seeking to discover. And this was just a simple object lesson to those who tried to pull Jesus into this binary yes, no, right, wrong view of the world. And Jesus refuses to dance to that tune. Bring me a coin, he says, and it will illustrate the reality of your own situation. Let's just get real and acknowledge that this theoretical world of yes, no doesn't exist. And as Matthew's gospel says again and again, being part of the kingdom of God is not about being corralled into some kind of religious ghetto where you can escape reality, but living by a different set of values and expectations within the one that exists around you. It's not about being a citizen of one or the other, but it's how we live as a citizen of both. And if life was as simple as yes, no, when it comes to paying your taxes, then this incident would never have happened. It was precisely because religion has political implications and politics have religious implications that the Herodians and the Pharisees were able to devise this question as a potential trap. It was precisely because of this reality that a largely religious group, the Pharisees, and a largely political group, the Herodians, lived in such loathing of one another. They couldn't just ignore each other because they were fighting over the same territory. So this is a vital episode as we seek to navigate our way through a disturbing and an uncertain and at times conflicting set of circumstances for us at the moment. This is not about Jesus offering us the choice of either living in the real world or a so-called spiritual world. The way that Jesus answers this question emphatically kicks that kind of thinking into touch. And as a people of God, as we respond to what's happening in the world around us, our calling is not to somehow rescue people from that world, nor is it about abandoning them to that world while we get on with our own spiritual agenda. It's about helping people to discover the currency of God within that world. The message of Jesus is about how to live as an authentic citizen of the kingdom of God in the authentic reality of our own earthly existence. Not by choosing between them, but by understanding what belongs to which and not allowing ourselves and our actions to be shaped in the light of that. Now that's easy to say, but what does that mean in practice? Well, let me try and illustrate that. And in our present circumstances, I couldn't miss the opportunity for offering this somewhat obvious illustration. Now, I realise that for many of us, having to access worship together online is not particularly ideal. But I want to suggest to you today that there's one advantage, because you can respond to what I am going to ask you to do in a moment in the privacy of your own living room, and nobody else who is engaging with this service can actually see you. Because what I want you to do is to put your hand in the air if you have ever been prosecuted for speeding. And those of you who have opted for the speed awareness course, I want you to put your hands up too. So here we are, admitting that we have been guilty of breaking the civic law. Okay, you can put your hands down now. And in case you're wondering, yes, I would have put my hand up as well. In fact, I would have had to put both of my hands up. But as a follower of Jesus, you could say, in theological terms, you've been declared righteous. So how come you accepted the points? How come that we didn't refuse to accept the fine and say, well, God's declared us righteous. You can't accuse us. There, I suggest, is a very clear and simple example of rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's and rendering to God what is God's. Now, I know that life is a lot more complicated than whether or not we should pay our speeding fines, but I hope that by framing it in such an obvious way, that kind of gives us a starting point for thinking about how we might apply this in our own more challenging realities. And I think that this episode can offer us more help in that respect. There's a part of Jesus's response that I think we can often overlook. You know, when I hear Christians quoting this statement, we do seem to have a habit of overemphasizing the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's bit, at the expense of reminding ourselves to render to God what is God's. And if you stop and think about it, the real issue at stake here, when Jesus is confronted by the Herodians and the Pharisees, was not about what they rendered to Caesar, because they'd already come to terms with that. They had the coins in their pockets. The challenge for them was rendering to God what was God's. In the case of the Herodians, they were happy to use the religious heritage of the nation to justify and cement their own position and gain. They essentially wanted what was God's to use for their own personal benefit. And that is, of course, what in any other circumstances the Pharisees would have attacked them for. But what the Pharisees weren't realizing was that they were doing exactly the same, because they had pretty much grabbed what was God's and claimed it as their own, in this case the law. They were all too happy to pronounce their judgments and to claim to speak for God. If only they'd stopped to discern long enough what God was actually saying to them through Jesus. God has come to them. God is standing before them, and instead of submitting themselves to God, which they claimed as their purpose, they reject Jesus outright because he doesn't meet their narrow definition of who God is. So what does that then say to us as we navigate our way through our own realities? How do we live as those who render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's in the midst of our own world? A world that feels very different at the moment, racked with confusion and fear and frustration and uncertainty. Well, the first thing it says is we can't escape that world. And our faith is not an escape from that world. It's a way of making sense of it. And the God that we seek in the midst of this world is not one who is indifferent or removed from it. So if this world is impacting on you, which I would be very surprised if it isn't, your faith hasn't failed. God hasn't somewhat abandoned you. We have to embrace our reality. Learn to recognize what is God's and what is not within this world. And that isn't a matter of carving the world into two nice, complete, separate halves. It's recognizing that these two worlds constantly impact and interact, and it's seeking to know what belongs to which. The question that we live with is, how do we express our identity as citizens of God's kingdom while living as citizens of earth? And that might be something as simple as wearing a face mask, so as to protect the lives of vulnerable strangers who are nonetheless loved by God and crafted in God's image. Keeping our churches closed can be no less an expression of belonging to God's kingdom than opening them up. If keeping them closed expresses our love for our communities, if it enables us to concentrate our efforts and our resources on enabling them to discover God's presence in the midst of isolation, then this might be as valuable as seeking to make them a place of invitation and welcome. And let's be honest with ourselves. If we manage to open up our buildings even for an hour or so a week, there's no escaping the fact that most people are going to spend most of their waking hours in isolation in the coming weeks, particularly here in the Northwest. Our calling is to help people discover God's presence in the reality of their experience, not to simply offer God's presence through a world that we wished existed instead. And living out our faith in ways that embraces reality is a call to speak out and to challenge those who might be described as the Caesars of our day, who seek to requisition the things of God for their own ends and purposes. And let's be honest, few of us can summons anything like the same level of intellect with which Jesus was able to offer such a fast and fluid answer to his critics. But maybe as we stand back and reflect on his response, this might simply for us be a call to thoughtfulness and prayerfulness as we seek to work out what belongs to God and what belongs to Caesar, and how we apportion things appropriately, and avoid instant and knee-jerk reactions to the conundrums that face us. And perhaps more than anything else, we can simply recognize that surrounded by a world of persistent and relentless evil, where oppressive regimes of many kinds seem to prevail unabated, Jesus offers us the assurance of a message of hope. Even when those realities are able to inflict themselves on him, that message of hope is unabated. Jesus responds not by waving a magic wand and making that world go away, nor does Jesus parcel us all off into some other world where all its problems have gone away. Jesus simply assures us that as we confront all of the realities for ourselves, God's message of hope, God's eternal purposes, God's enduring presence will never be thwarted. We will live in a world which is dominated by its own Caesars, but we can live in that world as those who belong to God and who render to God all that he rightly deserves. May God help us to do that. Amen.